My name is Dylan Israel. I'm a senior software engineer at PwC. I'm 32 years old. My girlfriend and I have 3 cats. In my free time, I work on side projects and watch anime. I'm a self-taught developer and proud 2-time college dropout. Parents, not so proud, but they're working on it. And I do not like long walks on the beach. I don't like the dirt in between my toes.
Say it's too coarse?
Yeah, so you know. A couple of my side projects that I've enjoyed is I have a YouTube channel that has about 70,000 subscribers, sort of how I taught myself development at the end of the day. I have about 1,000 videos / live streams. A couple courses out there on Udemy, Scrimba, and sometime in 2020, LinkedIn Learning. I also have a podcast called Self-Taught or Not. What we're going to be focusing on, very high level, we'll talk about in just a second, but how I like to take my approach to sort of sharing knowledge or learning is really 3 main things. I want to either teach something brand new that they don't know about. I want them to either improve something that they're already doing, so we always should get better, and we should keep it fun, right? Because the second you stop keeping it fun is the second you stop learning and you don't want to do this anymore. So I'm a little bit more casual, a little bit more relaxed than probably most people when it comes to that. As I'm here in my, I'm underdressed by most people who are speaking, had like suits on. I'm here up in my PlayStation shirt I pulled out of the dirty laundry this morning. Some topics we're going to be focusing on today. We're going to be talking about TypeScript, how to practice some clean code principles, and also a little bit of testing. Now, to go in a little bit more detail about that, we're specifically going to be talking about data models in TypeScript and how we can make our data models better and fail gracefully. We're going to be doing a little bit of testing with our mocks and abstracts, and we're going to be talking a little bit about Angular. I primarily work in the front end lately, so this is taking the approach of a very front end focused and ideology. And then my personal favorite, which is the shortest part of the talk, is some small things to make your TypeScript development easier. And that is what I'm all about. If we can automate things and we can make our life easier just by some configurations and VS Code, but let's talk about it, because I won't talk about why I even added that part to this talk. And a little bit, some shilling. If you want to see my YouTube channel, youtube.com/coding tutorials360, podcast, selftaughtornot.com. And we do have a Facebook group with a buddy of mine that you can just find on Facebook. All right, so let's get to the talk. We have sort of some fun subtitles, and it'll make sense in a second, for our clean TypeScript and testing. We have the very conservatively titled Sliding into the DMs Like a Coding God, which will make sense in just a second. So I want to take a look at this bad initial model example. It's a data model, it's a message, we're sending messages. It has things like an ID, a title, and a message. And how this is going to go is we're going to essentially go through the 15 steps of how this is going to continue to expand as requirements come in. You know, the business comes to us, they say, we need this tomorrow. You hack out something relatively okay, but you don't really necessarily think about the future features, and they say, no, this is a one-off, but we all know well enough, nothing is ever a one-off. They might use some keywords like, we're just going to do it this once, and anytime you hear just, you know that they're following up with a lie, typically, whether they believe it or not. So you can see here we have a basic model, and the first thing that we can kind of clean up about this model is we have this primary key ID. In what world are you ever going to reassign an ID, right? So we want to protect ourselves from making that mistake. We don't ever want to give it another ID. And so you can see here the issue is it can be reassigned, and we can relatively fix that pretty easily by using the read-only access modifier. So now, we can, part of the benefit of TypeScript is helping us help ourselves, right? At the end of the day, we want to prevent ourselves from going and making mistakes that are otherwise avoidable. So we can do something very simple about that. Now, as we go on, the business says, hey, we don't need a generic message, we need an error message, we need an info message, we need a success message, we need these additional messages. And so you say, okay, cool, I have 30 minutes to implement this. Let me go ahead and just add another property to our constructor. And yeah, it will work, but the thing that separates a dev that can do the job and a good dev is a good dev plans that their tomorrow isn't going to suck. And so here, we are not doing that plan, so okay, cool, let's just have this magic string called error to define our type. One solution, and we'll go through a couple different solutions here in a second, is defining an enum so that we don't make any of these additional mistakes here. And we can have these to provide a value and context. And this also make our, part of doing our data models better is it makes our testing easier as well, because now we have something that we can reference. I don't know about you, but I've had to call developer over developer on a test. I'm like, why isn't this test passing for 2 hours? And it's because I mistyped that magic string that nobody caught, because, I mean, even in this case, when I was making this slide, now that I look at it, in this previous example, it was a lowercase e in error, and in this example, is an uppercase. So, you can easily make these mistakes. We can solve this relatively simply. And on top of that, once we define our enum for these sort of non-changing values that are really, in this case, we could probably even add the read-only property on it, but our access modifier, but I didn't think about it till now, which is sort of also the point of this example is most of the things we're going to be going over are not things that we're going to just do and don't think about, or things that this is the best way of doing it. It's sort of an iterative process like agile development, right? And we can use that very enum to assign the type so that we make sure that when we pass into our constructor, in this case, we have our message type that's passing in and not just a string. Now, one thing, as I sort of alluded to, is that our model expands always. I don't know of any data model I've ever worked with where you wrote it once and you forgot about it unless they laid you off. That is essentially how that works out, right? You're going to continually expand. The business is going to want additional features. They're going to want maybe whatever the case is. And so our constructor will always become too large to handle. And so the way that I've gone about tackling this in the past is to always have the object have a single constructor that is an object at the end of the day. And right, for the time being, we just have this any, because oftentimes we're coming from an API and we can't really justify that the content is, or the data is coming in the form we expect. But now we're able to pass in this single object that we can then assign it. And it's a little bit more manageable. We don't have to start turning on word wrap so that we can see what our constructor parameters are. Now, as our models grow, one of the issues, and I don't know if I've only worked in crappy code bases at times, where you look at it and you're a little concerned, is that you start seeing these long null checks where it says if object and property, if object and property, and by the end of it, you do have word wrap on just so you can understand what is going on in your text editor. So one way that we can go about that is not only is that ugly and hard to maintain and hard to understand, we can instead simply provide default values for our constructor, things like empty strings, things like maybe a default type, and obviously in our read-only ID, we're not going to assign anything. My personal preference is to assign nulls for any values that you wouldn't necessarily go out of your way. That way, if it is coming up as undefined, I know that maybe it's from a third-party resource, or null shows intent that I set this to null. I know that where it's coming from. But you can sort of see down here we have this comment where it's a little itty bitty here, but we're taking our message property and we're splitting it, and it sort of works always, sort of, and that's not really what we want, right? We can be off by a single character, our whole code base is going to blow up. So here we're simply unwrapping the values of our object that are going to override our defaults if it's there. But what if we get bad data down the road that's going to say, oh, well, we do have a message property, and for some reason we've set it to a Boolean, or it's undefined, or we have a mismatch. So before I move on in, as you have probably noticed, I like to rant a little bit. And so I have this thing, you might be saying, why is this dude co-signing? How is that relevant? Well, when I think about working in the front end and integrating with an API, what you essentially do is co-signing a loan. I don't know about you, but I would never co-sign a loan for anybody. And because what happens is, very much like co-signing, is it might work for a little while, and then they miss a payment. And who has to make up that payment? You do when your app breaks, because you go to the business to say, well, the API we're using, they don't care. They want you to fix it. They're we don't care about assigning blame. And so part of the reason we're going through this process is to understand that don't be a co-signer. Don't co-sign in dev, don't co-sign in life, typically. But that's your personal business. So how can we go about having better defaults. You know, as I mentioned, that this isn't a perfect solution. As in this case, you know, we still have the same issue where maybe we get an undefined or null from a third party, and it becomes hard to maintain, and we don't want to have all those null checks. Well, we can do something slightly different. We can change our default logic, and I'm sort of taking you through the process of how my brain has worked as I've done some of these things, and you're like, okay, I think I made this a little bit better, and then it's good for a little while, and then it blows up, and I say, why did it blow up? I don't understand this. It worked sort of, worked always sort of, and now we're at work always sort of. And what you can see is we've changed this up to use ternaries. Now, in our example, we don't have any booleans. You'll have to change your boolean logic to make sense. And this is assuming in some of these primitives that you're passing in the right data type, which I'm going to give you a little bit of flexibility, but we could be a little bit more stricter if we really wanted to. And you can see, hey, if it comes in falsely undefined, we're going to give it an empty string and so on and so forth. And it's a little bit better than our previous defaults example. Now, one major issue that I've seen in the past that, you know, oh, my entire web app doesn't work, is almost always because some array is not defined and some list that you were expecting to iterate through in a template is blowing up completely. And that, I don't know, maybe it's just me, but that seems to be what a lot of the types issues are. And so let's take this example where we have a nested emoji array, because I mean, if you are trying to slide into the DMs like a coding god, you need an emoji at some point to say hello, or I don't know, whatever people send emojis for, poop emoji, whatever. And here in our example, we actually have valid data. It's just simply incorrect. It's an emoji class, and it should be an emoji array. So one way that we can go ahead and solve this specifically for this use case, and you can see relatively easily how we can start to apply this to objects, how we can apply this to strings and numbers and so on and so forth. You simply do a data check. Is this an array? If it is, go ahead and return it. If it's not, set it to a default array so that now in our templates, in our controllers, we can call those methods, those the maps, the filters, whatever, and we can iterate through them without having to worry that it's going to blow up the state of our application and do all those ugly null checks. Okay, so one thing that this also goes towards the being able to make sure that we have the right data when we create our tests, because I've had to in the past go, okay, we have these 5,000 line JSONs. Do I manually create that? What do I do? And it becomes kind of a headache. We want to make sure that we sort of cascade our types and our classes down together. Burping up that Italian. So you can see in our example here, we have an object that says for sure not an emoji property. As you would imagine, that's not part of the emoji class. But we have no way to instantiate that, hey, that object, of course, is containing what we would expect it to, which is almost as bad as us not having a proper array. Simple way, we still expand upon our data class, or excuse me, our array is array, and we say, oh, it is an array? Great, let's map that and pass our data into our predefined class, and then if it doesn't exist, we still just return an empty object, sort of no harm, no foul, but we still have access to it. Another sort of benefit of that is not only will our app not blow up because we'll have those properties and so forth, is that we also get access to helper methods. When we're passing things from an API or anywhere else, it's just data at a lot of the time, and we don't have necessarily the ability to, without creating something like this, to put some of that logic in. So sometimes you see things where you start throwing, in multiple components, logic that really isn't necessarily component specific so much as model specific, and now you have services that are just there because you try to clean it up a little bit. So you can see here we have our helper method that now we have the benefit of, which is get that annoying hello, which I don't know how much of a benefit is, but if it was something relevant, we'd have access to it, right? So we go on now where there's sort of been a theme, right, where we have defaults for everything, and you should, because you don't want to trust those third parties. They're bad. Not bad, but you gotta be careful. And we have to spell out the entire model for our test And we don't, as we currently have our constructor, we can't just initialize an empty model, so we gotta go one step further. Now, in our example here, we're gonna expand on by simply adding an empty object to our constructor. Then now we're gonna unwrap, and we still can instantiate this in our tests to be default, for default values, and make sure it's not gonna blow up, or even in our components where we have the ability to, we have a property and we can simply set it to something empty that we know, hey, we don't have to check at the top of, do an ngIf if we're doing Angular or whatever it is, that every part of our object is instantiated, and it sort of eliminates one part of additional logic and nesting. So the next thing I want to talk about here, we have Oprah, who very famously said your model gets an any, your service gets an any, and then your entire code base gets an any, which kind of defeats the point of TypeScript, right? At the end of the day, if you're just going to put an any on anything, shame on you. And secondly, just go ahead and use JavaScript. I mean, it's just, I don't get it, but this does happen, and so it's the bane of my existence. So you can sort of see I feel very passionately about this, and can cause a lot of data issues down the road. So how do we go about eliminating this any in our thing? And I would not recommend doing this slide, but I always like throwing off hacky solutions of how I go about things as I'm working in it. And so first thing we can do is take the very type that we're defining and in our constructor, and so that any replace it with such a thing. Now, one of the issues of this is that, and you can deal with this in various ways. I'm still coming up with the best solution, but technically that data property is part of your class. And so you sort of have this duplicate reference to your data, which when you send your data or do something with it, you want to either make sure to remove it, or you want to, if the API doesn't care, it'll get rid of it because it's going to map to its own model. But you can see here we're doing something very hacky where now we're casting it. Don't do that. But I thought it was fun to showcase how sometimes you have to jump through hoops to appease the TypeScript gods. And so that's one example. Let's give a better example of how we might go about doing that by using partials. So partials allows us to pass in TypeScript part of a data model so that we don't necessarily have to define the whole thing. Because there may be times where, hey, we're passing into our constructor and I don't have a title. All I have is an error has occurred or a rejection letter. I don't know what it would be, but we don't have a title and we can do that. And the added benefit to this is now we can catch typos in our code where we're passing in properties that, oh, I misspelled emojis and I put emoji, and that will catch it in your tests as you're doing it with UTS Lint and everything else. All right, so we've moved on, and I told you about how we're going to come back to this types, or at least I think I did. And adding a type to your class is almost always a mistake, because you're immediately, and this is something I've seen time and time again, you immediately start coupling different pieces of logic in a single element. And by its very definition, you're saying that this is a different type of specific item. So in our example here, for instance, we have an angry error message where we want to show this angry face and a couple exclamation points. It's in all caps, and I imagine the UI is going to put it in all red. Definitely not something you're going to say for a nice, successful message. Right? It's going to be a little bit more friendly. So one way that we can do that, in sort of the first iteration, is create an interface that we're going to extend off of that. We can still have the definition of our class, and then we can simply expand upon that by implementing it. That's one way. Now, one sort of issue with this is that that does give us the ability to expand upon our initial classes, and so now our original message class in our example here is transferred to the error message class, and so we would have an info message and a success message and so on and so forth. But as you go and you say, hey, I want to add like a similar functionality, such as this detailed message, which is simply a concatenation of the title and message, you have to then go, because in interfaces you can't add implementation logic, you have to then go and add that in 4 different spots. And after you add anything in 2 spots, you should probably have a red alarm going on that says, I done messed up and we got to rethink this. And so sort of a better implementation is using an abstract class, where we still get the same values. It's a little bit more specific now because we can add definitions for the access modifiers. And now we can go ahead and add that to our essentially our base class, our base abstract class message, that we have access to that in one spot, and that way if it changes, we can do something with it later on. And the only real difference here is that our error message is going to extend instead of implement. It's going to extend instead of implement, and we got to throw that super in there. I don't know. Does anyone really understand why someone chose super? This is sort of a personal thing. I never really understand, but that's just my personal thing. But it is what it is. All right, so we've gone and we've created a pretty solid model, and by the examples we can see how we might implement this for other pieces of data and objects and whatnot. But one common example happens now that you oftentimes don't have a single message, and you're saying, well, I need an array of messages, right? And you might implement functionality like this very basic one that simply checks if there's error messages on a page, and we might do that in several spots, and then we have to write tests for it in several spots, and then we have to make sure we actually just write it right in several spots. And you want list-like functionality for this singular model. Well, your first thing that might be, depending on how you like to do things, you might just write a function that you're going to export and import, and that works. I mean, all this stuff works, but is it going to work well? It's a different decision or a different choice. And as we go and we say, okay, well, we have another thing. Now we're importing a second function. Then you might, if you're working in Angular or some sort, you might create a service where you're injecting that. But that kind of feels like overkill, where now I'm sort of forcing my hand to get some basic functionality from a model. So what I would recommend is to simply create a messages class that extends the array prototype. Now once you've done that, you can have the functionality of, you essentially have your array that has some helper methods that's going to let you get there, like as in the instance of our error or the length of it, and we can simply instantiate it with our class, pass in the values. It's going to work exactly how an array would work, giving you the functionality that you want, and also putting it in a single location that you don't necessarily have to, sort of less overkill in my opinion, as you're importing and exporting functions. Okay, so I did have one little piece of testing that I was able to keep in this talk without running over. Let me check the time real quick. All right, so one thing I wanted to talk about, I'm going to go pretty quick because I want to get to the other part because I think that part's cooler. Oftentimes we're creating mocks for our APIs, our services that are going about that. So we have this very basic SEO service. And one major problem, and as you go and you can see here, we're adding it to our component or wherever we're adding it. One major problem is that as we go in here and we paste these things in here, oftentimes we're going to cast our mock service as an ini because we're actually injecting the third-party instance. The fix for that is simply to define our abstract class that has the definition for such a thing, and then we inject the abstract class, and this is in Angular, so depending on your framework of choice, you may have to do a little bit of the old switcheroo in your own way, but I'll show you how to do it in Angular. And then we're going to implement not only for our actual implementation of the service, but for the mock as well, we're going to implement that, just sort of like how we did in our model earlier. And then, of course, we have to let it know how to switch it. But this allows us to essentially have our service, or the items where we use our services, depend on the definition, not really care about if we're passing in the actual implementation logic or if we're passing in the mock for it, because it's both a valid use case, right? And then I think I actually put in the same slide twice. But, all right, so the last little part, because I want to leave some time for questions, is, I don't have as spicy of a title, but it's called Improve Your Workflow Like You're Salaried and Go Home Early, which is sort of my goal. And I imagine a lot of us use VS Code, so this is going to be VS Code related, but I want to rant for a second here. And you can see here we have this. I like memes because I think memes are honest and they get to the point. And so sort of the idea is that someday I'll fix the TS Lint warnings and other hilarious jokes you can tell yourself. You'll also notice it's volume 2, which says something. I've had the unique opportunity to go into new code bases where I'm figuring out why my I'm trying to figure out why my Lint isn't working, thinking that maybe I set the project wrong, only to be told that it was annoying, so we disabled it. And so that's sort of why I'm including this. So one thing that we can do to make our life a little bit easier is, and you can do this in your setup, is simply add the Lint, obviously, and go to settings JSON. Sometimes you can get there by Control P, although it works on my home desktop, but not my work desktop, but get to settings JSON. And we have the ability now to simply make it a little bit easier on us and set up so that on save, it auto-lints what it can. And that makes, it's sort of, my goal with getting lazy developers to be less lazy, and I'm lazy too, but is to make us, to remove their excuse as to why you disable things and make it so that, like, look, man, it's gonna do it for you. It's like magic. All right, so you can do that. Another cool thing that you can do with a couple settings is you can have it organize your imports for you and remove those from the top. I don't know how many files I've gone into and they've had 40 dependencies and they're all sort of slightly grayed out. And I'm thinking, like, man, I have to go and delete this. This will take care of that for you and sort of avoid some of that stuff. I've had some tech leads who have rejected PRs because I've left these things in here before, and then you're like, oh, okay. So let's just go ahead and take care of that. And finally, one of the ones that I like is, I know we've all sort of worked in folder structures in our projects that haven't made a whole lot of sense. And you're like, man, if we just move this here, this would flow more like the app flows and make a lot more sense, and people would know where to find things. But sometimes people don't want to do it because then they have to go rename 500 files. This will do that for you. All you got to do is, set it up, turn it in, and then do a Control S or save all, whatever it is, and then that takes care of it for you. And this isn't TypeScript specific, but my personal favorite that now gets me to Google everything on how I can automate anything is the format on save. So you can go ahead and format your code on save, have something a little bit easier. So I think it's what, Control Shift F nowadays. It's been so long since I've done it, but makes our code a little easier. So to sort of wrap up what I'm hoping from this talk we've been able to accomplish is, from the most interesting man here says, I don't always fail, but when I do it gracefully. So we want to fail gracefully. Avoid failing while we develop by utilizing some of the items that TypeScript have available. We also make our code more extendable, which is the data model, which is sort of part of the solid principles with the open-close principle. Make testing easier with the dependency inversion, and we'll automate a little bit of housekeeping. So that's my talk.
I want to take a moment to thank our long-term sponsor, Dev Mountain Coding Bootcamp. I had the pleasure of actually seeing some of their housing and the campuses, and it was just beautiful and a good time. I was really excited to go to Provo, and they were very nice and cordial. And so I've actually met some of the people who work there, and they're really good people, and they're trying really hard to bring the best program that they have. So if you're interested in UI, UX, full stack web, iOS development, QA, might I recommend checking out more info at devmountain.com, where you get housing with your tuition as well. Hey guys, don't forget to hit that notification bell or smash that like button while you're at it. And if you're interested, I just released my latest course, the 100 Front-End Technical Question Challenge, which is there to help you pass those front-end technical interviews. There's over 100 questions. You can get it for just $9.99. The link is in the description below, or use coupon code CodingGod.